Hello, my name is Ashley Covert. In this presentation, I offer a critical evaluation of NIMS's 2025 study titled Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury, published in Brain Science. The study examines a frequently overlooked clinical phenomenon, the neurological harm that survivors of interpartner violence sustain through repeated head trauma and strangulation-induced hypoxia. My analysis considers the study's theoretical framework, its methodological strengths and limitations, and its significance for behavioral neuroscience. I will proceed in 6 sections. I begin with the neurophysiological framework that distinguishes two injury mechanisms, then outline the study's background and purpose, its specific aims, and its methodology. I subsequently examine the principal findings before offering a critical evaluation of the work's contributions and limitations. Throughout, I will keep one analytical question in view: whether prevailing clinical models are adequate to detect injury arising from multiple concurrent mechanisms. Okay, I will begin with the theoretical framework. In neuropsychology, brain injuries are classified by mechanism, since the mechanism determines the pattern of damage. Traumatic brain injury results from mechanical force, whereas hypoxic-anoxic injury results from oxygen deprivation, most commonly through strangulation, and produces diffuse cellular death. A central limitation of existing literature is that clinical models, screening instruments, and recovery timelines were derived largely from athletes and military personnel, not from survivors who experience both mechanisms deliberately and concurrently. To situate the study, consider its epidemiological context. Approximately 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence, and assaults disproportionately targets the head, neck, and face, the anatomical regions most associated with brain injury. Despite its prevalence, such injuries are rarely identified, as survivors seldom attribute cognitive or somatic symptoms to brain injury, and frontline providers rarely screen for it. This result is a substantial public health gap. To situate the study, consider its epidemiological context. Approximately 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence, and assaults disproportionately target the head, neck, and face, the anatomical regions most associated with brain injury. Despite this prevalence, such injuries are rarely identified, as survivors seldom attribute cognitive or somatic symptoms to brain injury, and frontline providers rarely screen for it. The result is a substantial public health gap. It is worth specifying the injury mechanism precisely. Mechanical trauma arises from blows or impacts, rotational forces from shaking displace the brain, and strangulation deprives the brain of oxygen and blood flow. A subsequent loss of consciousness is regarded clinically as an indicator of a probable brain injury. Critically, for most survivors, there are not isolated events, but repeated, intentional injuries sustained over extended periods of time, and in some cases, multiple mechanisms occur within a single assault. This pattern of repeated dual mechanism injury disguises partner-inflicted brain injury from the single concussion event. The study addresses a specific gap in literature. Prior research has established that survivors accumulate head trauma over time, that strangulation is prevalent in abusive relationships, and that each mechanism can independently produce brain injury. What remained undocumented was whether both injuries affected the same individual, whether they co-occurred within a single violent episode, and how prevalent the combined injury is among help-seeking populations. The study's purpose was therefore twofold: to characterize survivors' lived experience and to define the construct of partner-inflicted brain injury. The study advanced two aims. The first was characterize the frequency with which strangulation and intentional head trauma co-occur, both across the lifespan and within specific episodes, such as the first and most recent assaults. The second was the estimate the prevalence of partner-inflicted brain injury among women seeking domestic violence services. It is important to note methodologically that this is a descriptive exploratory study without a manipulated variable or comparison group. Accordingly, it estimates prevalence and characterizes a pattern rather than testing a formal hypothesis. Turning to the methodology, the study employed a cross-sectional survey administered through in-person interviews, a format suited to sensitive subject matter. The sample comprised of 47 survivors seeking domestic violence services in Ohio in 2019. Participants were predominantly women and disproportionately economically disadvantaged, with more than 40% receiving Medicaid. The study was conducted within a community-based participatory action research framework in which survivors and advocates contribute to the design and interpretation, a notable methodological strength given the stigmatized nature of the topic. The interviews assessed three domains. First, lifetime exposure to head trauma and strangulation across all sources, including childhood, familial, and sexual violence, not solely the current partner. Second, episode level detail concerning whether both injuries co-occurred within the first and most recent partner violence episode, which permits inference about concurrent injury. Third, loss of consciousness and its frequency, a recognized marker of probable brain injury. Assessment at both the lifetime and episode levels is what enabled the documentation of concurrent dual mechanism injury. The principal findings are as follows. Across the lifespan, more than 80% of survivors had experienced both intentional head trauma and strangulation. Approximately 49% reported that both occurred within a single episode. More than 60% had lost consciousness following an assault at least once, and 44% on more than one occasion. Given the sample size of 47, these figures should be interpreted as indicative prevalence estimates rather than precise population rates. The principal findings are as follows. Across the lifespan, more than 80% of survivors had experienced both intentional head trauma and strangulation. Approximately 49% reported that both occurred within a single episode. More than 60% had lost consciousness following an assault at least once, and 44% on more than one occasion. Given the sample size of 47, these figures should be interpreted as indicative prevalence estimates rather than precise population rates. I wanted to highlight one finding in particular as it constitutes the study's central contribution. Approximately half of the survivors experienced head trauma and strangulation within the same violent episode. The biological implication is significant. The brain sustains a mechanical insult while simultaneously deprived of oxygen, and these insults may interact and compound rather than merely summate. This provides the empirical basis for treating partner-inflicted brain injury as a distinct dual mechanism clinical category. A second finding concerns the role of repetition. More than 60% of survivors had lost consciousness at least once and 44% on multiple occasions. The clinical significance lies in the repetition. Deliberately inflicted recurrent injuries differ qualitatively from a single concussion and are associated with cumulative effects. As loss of consciousness indicates probable rather than confirmed injury, these figures represent a conservative lower bound estimate. I'll now turn to a critical appraisal, beginning with the study's strengths. First, it is conceptually original, defining partner-inflicted brain injury as a precise and researchable construct. Second, its episode-level evidence constitutes a genuine and methodological contribution, demonstrating two mechanisms within a single assault. Third, the community-based participatory design facilitates candid disclosures on a stigmatized subject. Finally, the whole life analytic lens captures the full cumulative injury burden. Collectively, these represent substantiated contribution to the field. The study also has clear limitations. The sample of 47 survivors from a single state is small and geographically constrained, which limits generalizability. The absence of a comparison group means the design can describe a pattern but cannot isolate the injury's specific effects. The data are self-reported and retrospective, introducing potential recall bases, particularly as trauma can affect memory. Finally, no neuroimaging or neuropsychological testing was conducted, so the injuries are probable rather than confirmed. The study is therefore best understood as an initial characterization of the problem rather than a definitive estimate. So, why does this matter for behavioral neuroscience? First, it challenges injury models predicated on single mechanical concussion and argues for frameworks accommodating combined and repeated injury. Second, it draws attention to the understudied, predominantly female population historically underrepresented in the literature. Third, it reinforces the link between repeated injury and the cognitive and affect sequelae survivors report. Finally, it supports the case for routine brain injury screening in service settings. This is where evidence becomes obligation. The implications are concrete. Make screening for head trauma and strangulation routine, not rare. Recognize the dual trauma and treat the psychological and neurological wound together because survivors carry both. Open new research into concurrent and repeated injury and build the clinical model we still lack. And measure outcomes. Track whether our accommodations and referrals truly help. A finding is only as powerful as what we choose to do with it. Here you see the study's implication for practice and research. For practice, the authors recommend that education and screening for head trauma and strangulation become routine within domestic violence services, and that both the psychological and neurological dimensions of injury be addressed concurrently. For research, they call for a systematic study of concurrent and repeated injuries and the development of corresponding clinical protocols and models. They further emphasize outcome measurements, the systematic evaluation of accommodations and referrals, and the periodic reassessment of survivors' needs. The authors also present an applied framework for trauma-informed practice called CARE. The first component, C, stands for connect. This is where it concerns establishing the trust necessary for disclosure. A, acknowledge, refers to recognizing the characteristic effects of head trauma and strangulation. Respond denotes providing functional and social support appropriate for brain injury needs. Evaluate involves the ongoing reassessment of survivor needs and the effectiveness of the support. The framework operationalizes the study's findings into a structured model for service delivery. In conclusion, the study demonstrates that intimate partner violent injuries the brain through two concurrent mechanisms, mechanical trauma and oxygen deprivation, which are common across the lifespan, frequently co-occurring within a single episode, and are often repeated. Notwithstanding its small, descriptive, self-reported design, the study makes a meaningful contribution by defining partner-inflicted brain injury and reframing survivors as an important and undercategorized brain injury population. It indicates that behavioral neuroscience should investigate this combined injury, develop appropriate screening instruments, and inform treatment.